Welcome in to Kicking the Rear podcast. My name is Joe Yarshin. We dive into the real estate investment review today, episode 5. We're going to be talking about Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. Chris Voss is a former FBI hostage negotiator. He is an adjunct professor at Harvard Law School, and he does several business school teachings as well on the side. He's been featured on MSNBC, Fox News, several major networks, in his expertise in the field of negotiating. This is a business book, first and foremost. To start off, I wanted to let you know that even though it's not a real estate book, this book is directly tied to real estate because it would help you in a number of ways as a realtor, as maybe even as a lender, but as a buyer, as an investor. This is a great book because it's going to help you put together deals. It's going to help you negotiate better. It's going to help you be an overall better communicator and getting to the end result with empathy, understanding, and poise. So without further ado, I would love to dive into this book. Right away in chapter 1, Chris Voss goes into his high stakes scenario with a negotiation with some Harvard law professors. And immediately the book grabs your attention. And, he goes into kind of an introduction into negotiating and hostage negotiation and his journey as an FBI agent. Immediately in chapter 2, he starts discussing what good negotiators do. So I'm going to touch on some of these key points right away because I think all of these things that he bullet points at the end of each chapter is very relevant to negotiating in the investment real estate space as an agent, maybe, or just if you're buying a car, if you're haggling, if you're whatever you're doing to get a business deal done. Here's some key points right away that I thought were helpful. Second chapter is called Be a Mirror. So a good negotiator prepares going in to be ready for possible surprises. A great negotiator aims to use their skills to reveal the surprises that they're uncertain or that they're certain to find. Don't commit to assumptions. Instead, view them as hypotheses and use the negotiation to test them rigorously. People who view negotiation as a battle of arguments become overwhelmed by the voices inside their head. Negotiation is not an active battle. It's a process of discovery, asking the right questions. The goal is to understand and uncover as much information as possible. So to quiet these voices in your head during a negotiation, you want to make your sole and all-encompassing focus the other person. Typically, I know when you're sitting at the table with another person you're trying to negotiate with, whether it's like friends, family, someone at work, or even if it's, directly a business investing deal, you have to listen to them because quite often as humans, it's so natural to want to come up with the next thing to say next. You're focusing on what I'm going to say to respond to them rather than actually hearing them out, hearing what they have to say. This is a big theme in the book that he talks about, is having that empathy and really actively listening. This is a really good psychological skill as well in counseling. And when I was a psych major, I got to practice this in school a little bit in my counseling class. It was kind of an introductory class, but I remember kind of this piece of you have to actively listen so that you can respond appropriately based on what they say rather than just reacting. You're actively listening. So you want to slow it down. Going too fast in the negotiations is one of the mistakes all negotiators are prone to making. If we're in too much of a hurry, you can feel as if they're not being heard. You risk undermining the rapport and the trust that you've built. Coming from Illinois originally, everything's so fast paced, fast talking, fast results. You expect things quicker. Now that I'm in Tennessee, I find myself trying to slow down my rate of speech a little bit so that I can communicate with people more effectively. People in the South, it seems in my experience, tend to talk more deliberately and purposefully slower, not as rapid of a pace. So I think that's a good key point he says there. Putting a smile on your face. When people are in a positive frame of mind, they think more quickly, more likely to collaborate, problem solve, instead of fighting or resisting you. So positively creating mental agility in both you and your counterpart by smiling. He talks about 3 voice tonalities that you can use in negotiators. You have your late night FM DJ voice. He talks about using that voice to selectively make a point. You're going to inflect your voice downward, keeping it calm, keeping it slow. And then when done properly, you create an aura of authority, control, trustworthiness without triggering defensiveness. Also in that chapter, you can do a positive, playful voice. This is your default voice, he says, because it's easygoing, good-natured person. Your attitude is light. It's encouraging. Key here is to relax, but smile again while you're talking. So trying to take a little bit of his advice in my everyday speech. And then the third voice is the direct, assertive voice, used very rarely in negotiations because it will typically cause problems, create pushback in the negotiation. So the key takeaway from this chapter, though, is the mirrors. So you repeat the last 3 words or the critical words that they use last in their sentence of what they just said. So typically, if you watch The Office, Andy from The Office talks about personality mirroring. He does it in a joking way, but it actually works. I noticed that when you sit down at a meeting with somebody and you mirror their body language, you mirror what they say, they feel like they're being heard, and they also feel like you have common ground and that you're the same. Versus if you have very withdrawn body language and you don't repeat back to them what they said in a paraphrase or similar word manner, it's going to seem like you disagree with them. So we're going to go into chapter 3 here next. And within chapter 3, talking about imagining yourself in your counterpart's situation, having empathy. It doesn't demand that you agree with them or their ideas. You might even find them repulsive or crazy or unattractive, but acknowledging the other person in the situation, you immediately convey that you're listening to them. Once they know that you're listening, they might tell you something in the negotiation that you can use. Reasons why the counterpart will not make an agreement with you are often more powerful than why they will make a deal. So focus on clearing the barriers first to an agreement. You want to deny the barriers or negative influences that give them credence to get them basically into the open. Talks about pausing, being deliberate, having cadence. After you label a barrier or mirror a statement, let it sink in. So you don't have to talk the entire time. The other party is going to fill the silence. I know that when I was cold calling in retail banking, that was a big part of it is you get your spiel out, you get to the point, but then you let them talk because it's human nature to want to fill the silence. So then he talks about labeling your counterpart's fears to diffuse their power. So we all want to talk about the happy stuff, but the faster you interrupt the action in your counterpart's amygdala, he says, the part of the brain that generates fear, the faster you can generate feelings, safety, of well-being and trust. So then talking about listing the worst things that they could say about you and say them before they can. This is so funny because it reminds me of the movie 8 Mile when Eminem starts rapping about in the rap battle, all the bad stuff before his opponent can say anything bad about him. So it basically leaves the other guy speechless and without any bars. So if you can get all the bad raps out about you, they have nothing that they can hit you with, then you can really start pushing forward in the negotiation. It lowers their guard a little bit, makes you seem more human, but it also it extends it into a way that's exaggerated when it's said out loud, and it encourages the other person to claim that the opposite is true because you're kind of like, it's hyperbole almost. Like, oh, you're going to think I'm the worst person in the world, and then whatever they think you're going to say is going to be way worse than what you actually said. So I thought this was like a really cool, kind of like common sense thing almost, but it's like, if you take the brunt out of it at the beginning, you set the table, it's going to be more, authentic, and it's going to be well received when you do deliver bad news. So remembering you're dealing with a person who wants to be appreciated and understood. This goes back to the empathy principle again. So using labels to reinforce, encourage positive perceptions and dynamics. So page 94, chapter 4 talks about breaking the habit of attempting to get people to say yes. So you might think that's counterintuitive for negotiation, but I'll give you an example. Is like if you're trying to sell something to somebody over the phone, or you're trying to get them to agree to a meeting with you. If they say yes right away, it could be a good thing, but maybe they're just trying to get you off the phone. Like they just want to, stop talking to you. So being pushed for a yes makes people defensive. So if you give them the chance to say no up front, that can help. So our love of hearing yes makes us blind to the defensiveness we ourselves feel when someone is pushing us to say it. So no is not a failure. No is the beginning of the negotiation. We've learned that no is the anti-yes and therefore a word to be avoided at all costs, in the words of Chris Voss, but it's actually just means wait, or I'm not comfortable yet, or maybe I don't have all the facts. So learn how to hear the word no calmly. It's not the end of the negotiation. Again, it is the beginning. That is one of the best key takeaways from this book is no is actually the start of the negotiation. I've heard that on David Green's podcast. David is very astute in how he says that in his negotiations. He says no is not the end, it's the beginning. I think he's clearly read this book, or he's just a really good negotiator. But yes is the final goal of a negotiation, but don't aim for it necessarily at the start. You want to ask someone for yes. If you ask them yes too quickly, it could be bad. They can think you're an untrustworthy salesman, used car salesman, that kind of thing. So you don't want to go into it that fast. Saying no makes the speaker feel safe, secure, and control. So trigger it. By saying what they don't want, your counterpart defines their space. They gain the confidence and comfort to listen to you. So that's why is now a bad time to talk is a better way of asking than do you have a few minutes to talk? My partner at work, he's really great at that. He says that every time, we have a sales call or a scheduled call, hey, is now a bad time to talk, or is this still a good time to talk? It kind of disarms them a little bit, and it just gives them the chance to say no if they need to. But more often than not, they always say, yes, now is a good time. Sometimes the only way to get your counterpart to listen, engage with you is by forcing them into a no. So sometimes you want to hear the no right away. That means intentionally mislabeling one of their emotions or desires, or asking a ridiculous question. He says you could ask something like, it seems like you want this project to fail. Of course, what are they going to say? No. That can only be answered negatively. So it's kind of like a roundabout way of getting through them to say no. So you want to negotiate in their world. He says persuasion is not about how bright or smooth or forceful you are. It's about the other party convincing themselves to the solution you want is their own idea. So I always come back to this expression my grandfather told me, which is you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. If you try to force them to drink, it's not going to happen. So you don't want to beat them into submission with logic or brute force. You want to ask them questions that open paths to your own goals. It's not about you. It's about the collaboration. And then if a potential business partner is ignoring you, contact them with a clear and concise, no-oriented question that suggests you're ready to walk away. Have you given up on this project? Works wonders. I was just telling my colleague the other day that that's a really great way to end an email, according to Chris Voss, is if you're trying to get them to respond, hey, have you given up on this project? I use this negotiation tactic most recently in my fantasy football league, in my friends and family league. Shout out to Eric. I said that to him via text. I said, hey, have you given up on our trade negotiations? Sure enough, the next day he responded. We got the deal done before the start of season 1, and I secured my favorite quarterback, Tom Brady. So yeah, this stuff works. It's great information, and I'm very confident about it so far. So I hope you guys will take some insights into this too. So going into chapter 5, creating unconditional positive regard opens the door to changing thoughts and behaviors. Humans have an innate urge towards socially constructive behavior. The more a person feels understood and positively affirmed in that understanding, the more likely that urge for constructive behavior or change will take hold. So hearing the word "that's right" in response to what you're talking to them about is better than a yes. Strive for when they say that's right, because reaching that's right in a negotiation creates breakthroughs. Using a summary, Chris says to trigger a that's right. So building blocks of a good summary are labeling combined with paraphrasing. This is just, again, good consultative selling. It's good listening and empathy. Identify, re-articulate, emotionally affirm the world according to this person that's across from the table from you. Going into chapter 6, got some good page breaks here. I like to stay organized. It says all negotiations are defined by a network of subterranean desires and needs. It reminds me of the id, ego, superego, Freudian. The surface might be the tip of the iceberg, but there's something deeper beneath it. So don't let yourself be fooled by the surface. Once you know, he uses a story about these Haitian kidnappers. They just wanted party money. So he talks about how they were holding people, kidnapping them ransom just to get party money on the weekend. So they would come up with this outrageous figure that people couldn't pay, and then they would settle for less than that, or even the most amount they could get out of these people. So, if you can kind of see what the other person's motive is beyond the surface, you can kind of begin to understand them better. So, asking surface level questions, closed-ended questions isn't always the best way. And consultative selling skills we're taught to ask open-ended, high-gain, closed-ended questions, a combination of all of them. That gets the person opening up, that gets them talking. He finally uses the title in the book. He says, splitting the difference is wearing one black and one brown shoe, so don't compromise. Meeting halfway often leads to bad deals for both sides. So let's say you and your spouse are arguing about wearing a pair of black socks and brown socks. He illustrates the principle that, hey, if you want to wear black socks and your wife wants you to wear brown socks, you guys compromise. You wear one brown and one black. That doesn't make anybody happy. That doesn't make me or my spouse happy by wearing one of each. So literally the worst thing you can do, he says, is splitting the difference. Talks about approaching deadlines. Approaching deadlines entice people to rush negotiating process and do impulsive things that are against their best interests. So while it might seem positive to implore deadlines, if you are the one receiving deadlines, he's suggesting you can't react to the deadlines and urgencies as gospel. You have to really take away that urgency timeline, even in a tough negotiation, because if you nothing's life and death when it comes to business deals necessarily, unless you're doing, I don't know, a hostile, corporate takeover or something. But even in that scenario, there is a level of variability to a timeline. You don't have to accept the timeline. So he talks about the F word. The F word being fair is an emotional term people exploit to put the other side on the defense, gain concessions. So, hey, that offer I just sent you was fair. Well, very subjective word, right? But it gets them to be defensive when you use that word. When your counterpart drops the F-bomb or fair, don't get suckered into a concession. Instead, ask them to explain how you're mistreating them. Says you can bend your counterpart's reality by anchoring a starting point. He talks about this anchoring thing a lot. It reminds me of this business TikTok I saw about how Costco, for example, they do a lot of price anchoring. They put the televisions in the front of the store, the very high ticket, expensive items in the front of the store because they have the highest prices. The price anchoring then makes you think, oh, okay, this 2-pack of soap isn't so bad because that TV in the front was $1,500, but hey, this is only $20 or whatever. That's an example of the price anchoring. And he uses that in a different example in the book, but that just made me think of a real life example. So basically before you make an offer, you emotionally anchor them by saying how bad it will be. Again, talking about all the bad stuff on the front end. When you get to the real numbers, set an extreme anchor to make your offer real, offer seem reasonable, or use a range to be less aggressive. So a range kind of softens your offer. The real value of anything depends on the vantage point you're looking at it from. So again, if you're the one price anchoring or you're getting price anchored, you kind of just you have to shift your perspective. People will tend to take more risk to avoid a loss than realize a gain. This is so true. You'd rather buy insurance than double down on an investment, maybe because you're afraid of loss. That's the immediate thing that comes to mind is most people will always buy insurance or rather than spend twice or double the amount on something that could double their return. Making sure your counterpart sees that there's something to lose by not doing it. So, hey, if you don't act on this now, you're going to miss out on this. Chapter 7, let's see. This one really had to do taking control of conversation. So you want to try not to force your opponent or your adversary in the deal to admit that you're right. Because if you try to force them into submission, again, that's aggressive confrontation. It's the enemy of constructive negotiation. Avoid questions that can be answered with yes or tiny piece of information. That's, again, close-ended question. So close-ended questions might be valuable in very scarce, small amounts, but you don't want to have the broad context of your negotiation using closed-ended questions. They require little thought, inspire the human need for reciprocity, so you'll be expected to give something back. If you ask them a yes-no question, then maybe they're going to ask you a yes-no question. You're not getting too far in the negotiation. This is one of my favorite parts, if not my favorite. He talks about calibrated questions that start with words how or what. If you ask, hey, how am I supposed to do that? It puts them kind of at a loss and they kind of have to solve your problem for you. How am I supposed to do that? Well, maybe you could do this. I think this is a good question to ask at a car dealership when you're trying to haggle price. You get them to fill in the blanks of what's needed to move the deal forward rather than you. You have to make them solve your problem for you. And implicitly asking the other party for help, questions like these will give your counterpart the illusion of control. It'll inspire them to speak at length, revealing important information. Again, this is one of the best sections of the book. Page 160 kind of is the high level overview of what this is, but this is my favorite thing. Don't ask questions that start with why unless you want your counterpart to be defensive and defend a goal that serves you. So why comes across as an accusation in any language. So why did you make that decision? Why did you do that? It sounds so negative. Unless you're saying, hey, why would you work with me? That's the other way you can spin a why question in a positive regard, but that's the only time you want to use this. Hey, why would you want to close this deal with me today? I like how he used that. I think it's a really good questioning strategy. He says to calibrate these questions to the point your counterpart towards solving your problem, encouraging them to expend their energy on coming up with a solution. He says, bite your tongue, because when you're attacked in a negotiation, you want to pause, avoid angry, emotional reactions. Keeping a zen level head. Ask your counterpart a calibrated question when you're tempted to be angry, because there's a fine line between having emotions conveyed in a negotiation, which can exude passion and interest, but then it can also be received as aggressive, angry in a negative way, which would derail the conversation and put people on the defense the whole time, and then you're never getting anywhere. So there's always a team on the other side of the person. If you're talking to one person, you might not be talking to the whole team there. If you're not influencing the people behind the table, you're vulnerable. Going into the next chapter, again, he talks about asking these calibrated how questions. Ask them again and again and again. This is where you beat them down into submission, because you're asking them how. It keeps your counterparts engaged, but off balance. Answering the questions gives them the illusion of their control. It leaves them to contemplate problems when making their demands. Using how questions to shape the negotiating environment. So you're framing the environment. You do this by saying, how can I do that? I said that one before, but gentle version of no. This will subtly push them to search for other solutions, which happen to be your solutions. Very often it'll get them to bid against themselves. I can see this being a great tool for agents. Like, you're making the other agent bid against themselves. Don't just pay attention to the people you're negotiating with directly. Always identify the motivations of the players behind the table. You can do this by asking how a deal will affect everybody else and how on board they are with their decision or the choice that they make. He talks about a 7-38-55% rule. Basically pays attention to the tonality of their voice, their body language. If you see incongruences between these things, the words and the nonverbal signs, it'll show you when your counterpart's lying, uncomfortable inside of a deal. And then people use the word yes as a counterfeit or a real answer to agreeing to a deal. Test it with the rule of 3. You use calibrated questions, summaries, and labels to get your counterpart to reaffirm their argument at least 3 times. So if you ask them, hey, do you want to go forward with this purchase? You're comfortable with the purchase. What do you like about potentially doing the purchase? It kind of gets them to agree 3 times. It's really hard to fake or lie 3 different times. So that's what can kind of unearth an authentic yes. A person's use of pronouns. This is really interesting. A person's use of pronouns offers deeper insight into their relative authority to a negotiation. So if you're hearing a lot of the words I, me, my, the real power lies with the team or the other people they're working with. If they say we, they, or them, typically they are the one in control. They are the decision maker, but they want to keep things open for them. So using your own name to make yourself a real person. So using your own name as a personal discount, humor, humanity are the best ways to break the ice, remove roadblocks. In chapter 9, talks about identifying your counterpart's negotiating style. Once you know whether they're the accommodator, the assertive type, or the analyst, you'll know how to correctly approach them. I notice that sometimes I tend to be an accommodator. The assertive one is the author, Chris Voss. Analysts are very calculated, can be cold, and it's important for them to smile, he says. So I love this chapter because he goes into the 3 different negotiating style types, and you need components and aspects of all 3 in order to be a great negotiator. Preparing. When the pressure is on, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your highest level of preparation. So designing ambitious but legitimate goals right out of the gate with labels, calibrated questions, responses. That way, once you're at the bargaining table, you won't have to wing anything. Get ready to take a punch, he says. Kick-ass negotiators usually lead with an extreme anchor to knock you off your game right away. He quotes Mike Tyson in this chapter. He says, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. Might have paraphrased that, but that's the gist of the quote. If you're not ready, you flee to your maximum without a fight. So you prepare your dodging tactics to avoid getting sucked into the compromise trap. Compromising, not a good way to negotiate. You have to set boundaries, learn to take a punch or a punch back without anger. The guy across the table is not the problem. The situation is. Preparing an Ackerman plan. Love this one. Before you head into the weeds of bargaining, you're going to need a plan for the extreme anchor. You're going to calibrate the questions, have well-defined offers. You're going to use the 65, 85, 95, 100% approach. He goes into what that is in the book. I won't get into it because it's long-winded, but it's he does make it concise in that chapter. Once you understand it's better, but I'll leave something for the imagination because I think that's a great one. Decreasing raises and ending on non-round numbers to see specificity. It gets your counterpart to believe that they're getting all that you're worth, but really it's the numbers you want, and the specific number also makes it seem like you've thought it through. So, if you come to a number of $5,000, that's very even and round. It seems kind of vague, but if you say 5,327, it seems like you've really given it a lot of thought. So in the last chapter, chapter 10, which he calls the Black Swan, which he named one of his companies after, He talks about finding these black swans, which are the unknown unknowns. And these are only derived from really paying attention to the conversation and listening to their motivation. Because if you can identify your known knowns, you can let the known knowns of the conversation guide you. You don't want them to blind you. Every case is new. Be flexible, adaptable, be like water. Remember, he talks about this Griffin Bank crisis. So there was no hostage taker ever that had killed a hostage before on a deadline until this guy did it. And so he talks about, like, sometimes the motivations are hidden. You have to be aware that you don't know everything going into a negotiation. So black swans he labels these as black swans. They're leverage multipliers. So the three types of leverage you can institute in a negotiation is positive. So to give the ability to give someone what they want. The negative leverage is the ability to hurt somebody. He says you don't want to lean on this too heavily, but normative leverage is using your counterparts' norms to bring them around. He talks about understanding the other side's religion. So if you can see and think how they see the world, you don't have to agree with them, but you can kind of understand that their worldview inherently implies what they're doing beyond the negotiating table into their life, emotional and otherwise. That's where the black swans live, he said, in these people, in their religion. So review everything you hear from your counterpart. You will not hear everything the first time. You have to double check. That's, again, paraphrasing, mirroring, reading it back to them, paraphrasing. Compare notes with team members. If you have people working with you on a negotiation, everybody has a different perception. So if you have team members working with you in a negotiation, like, you got to compare notes to see what really is the true message and motivation behind your counterpart. Exploiting the similarity principle. So people are more apt to concede to someone they share a cultural similarity with. He uses an example of, like, you went to the same college, or maybe you went to the same fraternity, or maybe you went to the same high school, or you're in the same social club, or something in that respect. When someone seems irrational or crazy, they most likely aren't. So faced with the situation, you want to search for constraints, hidden desires, and bad information, because maybe they seem crazy, but they're just operating under a false assumption. They don't have all the facts. And so if you can supply them with the information and the facts, you can get them to not feel so crazy in the negotiation. You want to get FaceTime with your counterpart. 10 minutes of FaceTime reveals more than any type of research you could do on them alone. Pay attention to their verbal, nonverbal communication at unguarded moments. He says that these unguarded moments are at the beginning and at the end of a session, or when someone says something out of line. So paying attention there. At the end of this book, he says something that kind of resonated with me, because he talks about, like, the one takeaway from this book is he wants you to embrace conflict. So I know that growing up, I tried to be a pacifist, or kind of like mitigate problems and help people come to peace. But, like, sometimes peace is not the solution. In fact, conflict and being comfortable with the conflict is actually the healthiest way. And so in my own personal life, I'm using this, but also embracing conflict in a deal, taking the heaviness out of it, kind of make it more light. In fantasy football, again, embracing the conflict, like, hey, this is going to seem like the worst offer in the world when I send it over, but hear me out, can be better received than, hey, this deal works for you, it works for me. Like, it's just too easy. You don't want to go down that path. So kind of to wrap up here, he has an appendix here where you can prepare a one-sheet negotiation. This will guide you through your preparation for a negotiation. It's really awesome. I'd like to use this sometime soon, but just the facts from his first 10 chapters, I think, are really great, and is sufficient enough to win a negotiation. So overall, I would give this book 999 out of 1,000. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's pretty damn close. So I would highly recommend you buy this book if you are ever trying to win a negotiation, if you're trying to get better at negotiation, or simply if you want to communicate better, have more empathy in your conversations. I think this book really kind of, it puts life in a different perspective, because he saw negotiations from a literal life or death scenario, and most things are not life and death. So if you treat your negotiations as if they're life or death, you might actually win a few. So I had a great time reviewing this book, and I love sharing all the information with you. I look forward to next week. I think we're going to do another real estate central book. So looking forward to that. And I hope that if you enjoyed this, you'll like and subscribe. Again, bippity boppity investment property. Have a great day. See you next week. Let's go.